chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 5. He complains, the Lord responds. He complains again, the Lord responds. And so we get that, and then in chapter 3, where we get God pronouncing woes upon the people of Babylon, or the Chaldeans, and then in chapter 3, we get his prayer, which is poetic, which is prophetic. It's in a style of poetry, which is kind of a lament, and we get that from the strange word you see listed in the very beginning of chapter 3. But we'll get to that in a little bit. This is the big picture. But let's look now at complaint number 1. Complaint number 1 starts in chapter 1 on down to verse 4. It's the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long will I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise, so the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. So he starts out by giving a list of problems that God seems to be ignoring. You know, he's kind of come to the conclusion. He's been crying out for a long time. The enemy is getting closer. He has no understanding or perception on what God's plan is, what the bigger picture is. It seems as if he doesn't have a really good grasp on the sovereignty of God. You know, even though he was a prophet, even though, you know, he was a guy who was passionate about what the Lord would do, it would just seem like in some areas he just didn't really fully understand the grand scope of how God worked. And so he was looking at the world around him and just said, look at all this evil. And he listed the things off. He had a list of problems that God seemed to be ignoring. He said, Lord, I don't know if you realize this or not, but there's some bad things going on down here. There's a lot of violence. There's iniquity, there's destruction, there's contention. The law has no power, it's paralyzed. The wicked are dominating, and the justice is perverted. And he's crying out to the Lord. You know, it's called a complaint. He's complaining to the Lord. Lord, maybe you don't see what's going on, but bad things are happening. So we get his condition. It says he's been crying out for a long time, and God is silent. And then that's probably something that we can relate to, or we've been around people who can relate to this, who are like, you know, I've had this issue, and I've been praying about it for a long time. It just seems like God's not doing anything. And that affects some people. You know, they went into it with faith, be it a health issue, a relationship issue, job issue, whatever. They went into it with faith saying, you know, Lord, you're going to fix this the way I want it fixed. And so they go in praying that way, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait. And the Lord's like, I have a total different idea here. I have a bigger picture going on. But we don't see that because we want the plan we came up with when we started praying to be the one that, you know, God goes through with. So, you know, Lord, I have a problem, and my solution is that I'm going to get this much money, I'm going to get a raise, I'm going to get a promotion, and, you know, and a new car. So that's the solution. Here's my problem. I'm going to start praying. I've been praying, Lord, for 3 or 4 months. None of those things have happened. I've been praying, Lord, for a year. None of those things have happened. And people are like, where's the Lord? Lord, can't you see my problem? This is how you solve it. And God's like, I'm not giving you that stuff. I have a bigger plan. I have a bigger picture. And that's where this guy is. He's frustrated. He's feeling hopeless. He seems to not understand, you know, how God does things, how the breadth and the scope of what he does is so much bigger. And yet this is God's prophet, which makes me, you know, which made me think, you know, the prophets, they heard from God. But that doesn't mean they necessarily understood God. They were just the ones who were able to hear and willing to write it down. You know, sometimes we think, you know, God can only use me if I graduate to this certain level of spirituality, if I gain this much knowledge in the Word and I've memorized entire chapters of the Bible, then God can use me. And God's like, you know, I got these prophets that I used. One guy just kept trying to run away from me, so I had to like stick him in the ocean for 3 days. And so he went and did my message, and he didn't even want to. He complained about it after. That was one of my prophets. Here's another prophet that he's just sick and tired that I'm not doing what he wants me to do. God uses who God uses. I always fall back on that picture of Samson. Why in the world is Samson in the hall of faith? Hebrews 11. What's he doing there? But if you go back and you read about him, even though he did so many knucklehead things, every time he had to do something miraculous, he went without hesitation. Like he wasn't even fazed by the fact that the feat before him was not humanly possible, unfazed at all. He said, I can do this. I can kill all these people. I can do all of this stuff against these people, because he had faith that God could. And so here God is using a guy that we would look at and we would just say, Lord, I don't think you want to use this guy. He's kind of a whiner. He's kind of a complainer. But the Lord's like, yeah, but he hears from me. And he writes it down. And so I'm going to use him. And so this is complaint number 1. And then we get God's answer. Verses 5 through 11. Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astonished. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. Now, at that point, Habakkuk is probably like, whoa, I'm about to hear some good stuff. The Lord is excited about what he's doing. Man, I wonder what it's going to be, this incredible thing. And then he says, for behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. And then verse 9, they all come for violence. All their faces forward, they gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff. At rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they go by the like and win and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God. So God sounds excited about what he's doing. Oh, Habakkuk, I'm glad you asked. I know it seems like I've been kind of distant. I've been kind of silent. I know it seems like there's lots of wickedness going on around you, and you're true, there is. But I have a bigger plan, and I'm excited about it. And then he says, I'm taking responsibility to raise up the Chaldeans. Now, first question, who are the Chaldeans? Well, the Chaldeans were part of the Babylonian Empire. And lots of times in our Bibles, it just kind of, we'll go back and forth. It might say Babylonians one time or Chaldeans another time, and it might cross them over. But they were just kind of a group of people within the Babylonian Empire. A lot of the first 3 or 4 kings over Babylon were Chaldeans. And so the term is used kind of for both the Babylonians and the Chaldeans. And God says he's responsible for raising them up. In verses 6 through 7, he said, you wouldn't believe this great army I'm raising up. But first of all, he lets Habakkuk know, I know they're evil. In verses 6 through 7, he talks about how evil they are. They are not good people. They're evil. But then in verse 8, he talks about how they're strong. Like this army can do mighty things. And this is the tool I want to use to do my work. This mighty, strong army. Then verse 9 through 11, he says, this is what they will do. This is what will happen when they come. And this totally sets Habakkuk off. He's like, I don't get this at all. Like, he is totally surprised. And it almost seems like he's going to get a little disrespectful here. Beginning at verse 12, he says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One, we shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? So Habakkuk here is contrasting God's character with God's behavior. And in a way, he's saying, Lord, this is the way you are. This is what we've learned about you. But it would seem like you're not following suit with your character. He can't believe that his good, holy God is just going to allow this wicked nation to continue on in wickedness. It almost seems disrespectful because he starts out by saying, you're eternal, you're holy, and yet you ordain these wicked people to bring judgment upon us? And then he says, you're pure and you cannot look upon evil, and yet you idly sit back and watch as evil runs rampant over all of us. So it's almost as if he's being disrespectful, contrasting these two against each other. Verse 14, you make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet, for by them he lives in luxury and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Now, this section starts out as being a little confusing. Habakkuk sees the mysterious work of God through the limitations of his own understanding. He's essentially telling God, God, I don't understand what you are doing. It seems all wrong. Under the attack of the Chaldeans, they, Judah, are like fish. That's what he's talking about here. We, the innocent ones, under the attack of this evil nation, we are like these fish. We're caught and we're gathered. And then these Babylonians, these Chaldeans, they celebrate with all the fish they're gathering, all the people they capture. They celebrate. And they don't hear God. Their God is, it says, their nets. What he means by that is their God is their might, their own strength. They are a people who idolize themselves. They've been conquering nations and gathering captives. And he's like, will their evil continue? Will it ever come to an end? And then in verse 1, he says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So Habakkuk is a little frustrated, a little angry, a little disrespectful. And then he does something kind of cool. He says, I'm going to go to this watch post and I'm going to wait until I hear from the Lord. That's his attitude. A lot of people get angry at the Lord because of their misunderstanding of him, and they turn their back. Here's a guy who got angry at the Lord and said, I need an answer, and I'm going to stand here. And I'm going to look out over the plains outside of the city, and I'm going to stand here and wait until you give me an answer. And God's answer comes, verse 2. And the Lord answered me, write this vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, the soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. But the righteous shall live by his faith. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. So here's God's answer. First thought, God actually gave him an answer. After that complaint, here's what I don't feel like giving my kids when they come and they disrespect me and they complain to me. I don't feel like giving them an answer. That's when we parents say things like, because I told you. And it almost seems like, that would be God's answer at this time. Habakkuk, I got it taken care of. Stop complaining. Why, Lord? Because I told you. That's where we would be. But God actually gives him an answer in spite of his attitude. I don't like to give answers to people who ask with a bad attitude. God did. So he says, write it down and patiently wait for it to be fulfilled. And this message is going to be written down, and he says, I want it written down so that anyone who reads it can run from the sins that is bringing the destruction upon them. Write it down. So, even when I'm confused by what I see, I still know that God isn't lying. God will bring his answer in his time, and when it's time, it will happen. And that's what he's telling Habakkuk here. I know you don't understand it, but I'm not a liar. I know you can't see what's going on, but in my time, it will happen. So just wait. Just be patient. Yes, the Chaldean soul is puffed up. Verse 4, but the just don't live by arrogance. See the contrast here? These guys are all puffed up. They're arrogant. They worship themselves. They idolize themselves. But they're not just. The just, in contrast to them, live by faith. They don't live by their own strength. They don't live by their own power. They don't live by their pride that leads them to conquer other nations and to gather many things. They don't live by that. That's what the evil live by. The just live by faith. So there's a contrast here. It's the most quoted section of Habakkuk. It's quoted by Paul in Romans 1:17 and then by Paul in Galatians 3:11, and then maybe by Paul in Hebrews 10:38, or maybe someone else. So the idea here is stop worrying about the way that the evil live. We're surrounded by evil people doing evil things. It's like, stop worrying about the way evil people live. Start thinking about the way you are supposed to live. Yes, cry out against evil. Yes, pray for evil. Yes, warn people about evil. But know God is the owner of judgment and vengeance. That's his. We're like, what are we going to do about all this evil? God's like, pray for them. Warn people about it. But when it comes to doing something about it, the Lord is like, that's my job. It is my job to bring vengeance. It is our job to live by faith. So, not only is the Chaldean proud, but in verse 5, they're drunk, they're greedy, they're unsatisfied, and they're continually oppressing people. So the Lord makes it clear, hey, I understand that, even though your people are wicked, and I'm bringing a nation against you that's more wicked, and you're upset about that, please understand, I know they're wicked. I know. And the Lord always makes it clear that these nations that he brings against his own people, though he uses them as his tool, as his weapon, he always makes it clear they will not get a pass. They are wicked. They will be judged. And so he speaks woes upon them, beginning in verse 6. Let's read the first one on down to 11. Shall not all those take up their taunt against him with scoffing and riddles for him to say, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own? For how long? And loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them, because you have plundered many nations. All the remnant of the people shall plunder you, for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in it. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. So the first woe is about their wicked financial practices. They've taken possession of many people, and the goods of many people, and the riches of many people. And in this we see that one day they will be plundered as they have plundered others. The remnant of those whom you have plundered will turn around and plunder you. So in this first woe, the Lord declares they're going to get their due. Judgment is going to come upon them. Then in the second woe, verse 12 through 14, we find out that they're a nation that builds and exists and prospers under the yoke of slavery. Verse 12, woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city in iniquity. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the watcher covers the sea. So here the woe is against these Chaldeans for their practice of slavery and how they build their towns with the blood of their slaves who gain nothing for them. So they work all day just for some fire to warm themselves. They work all day basically for nothing. And then he ends it with this little, word of promise. And he does it again with the next woe, but for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And there he's looking way ahead. Bad things are happening now. God is going to bring judgment. But then you get this little prophetic picture as if God is speaking of the final judgment that's going to come when he makes all things new and the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. I don't know. There's a lot of questions around that one verse and why it's there and what it refers to. So, verse 15 through 17, we get the next woe. These are a people who led with oppression. Verse 15, woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup of the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. Verse 17, the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them, for the blood of man and violence to the earth. So here he speaks of their leadership is oppressive. They glory in oppressing others. There's this little illustration here. It says their wrath is like alcohol that they make people drink. So people drink their wrath and they fall under the influence of it. And it says they do this so they can see their nakedness. And by that they mean they do this, they bring their wrath upon them so they can see them shamed and in reproach and weak. And then the final woe is their idolatry, verse 18. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath in it at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth silence before him. And so here again, he's speaking to their ridiculous practice of idolatry. This thing that you worship, this thing that you center your lives around, it has no life. It has no breath in it whatsoever. But where there is life and where there is breath is in the Lord's holy temple. So the book wraps up in chapter 3 with a prayer. This is Habakkuk's response to everything that the Lord has done and what the Lord has said. So basically in verses 1 and 2, he's saying, okay, Lord, let it happen. I'm ready. Let it happen. But before that, we see that in verse 1, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to Shigionoth. And I'm like, what in the world is Shigionoth? It's not a word we use very often. You know, how many of you have said Shigionoth today? Or ever in your life, ever? Yeah, me neither. But basically, it's saying that this prayer at the end is in the form of a song, but it's a song of mourning and a song of lament. So when he wrote out this prayer, it had a poetic essence to it, and it would have been obvious to those who are reading it in Hebrew. So verses 1 and 2, verse 2, it says, O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, do I fear in the midst of the years? Revive it in the midst of the years. Make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. So here he says, okay, Lord, I've heard all this. Now you can let it happen. I believe you. I trust in you. But Lord, now please just let it happen. Verses 3 on to 7, he says, God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. So this is a demonstration of God's power. And we see some of the other prophets have written this too. God's presence came, and this is what his presence would have done upon creation. It's a reminder probably to himself. Habakkuk needed this reminder personally, about how great and powerful and mighty God was, how God's working reaches beyond the breadth of his understanding. His own limited world and the little things that he was seeing around him. And he was like, God, how come you're not doing anything right here in my little world right here? How come you're not doing what I think you should do? And God's like, because I'm out here doing a thing that if you understood it, it would blow your mind. It's amazing, but you're not going to understand it. And Habakkuk didn't understand it. But he finally came to a place where he's like, Lord, let it happen. I trust in you. And I recognize again how powerful this God that he was recently complaining to was. In verse 8, was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea, when you rode on your horses, on your chariots of salvation? You stripped the sheaves from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hand on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped at the flash of the glittering spear. You marched to the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of the warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. What we get in all of this is a lot of imagery that would cause those who are reading it to look back at what happened in Exodus. There's a lot of little images and references here that would cause them to look back and remember how God delivered Israel out of Egypt and the things that happened. So you get little glimpses, little pictures in the poetic essence of this prayer that reference back to that Exodus. And in this we get a message, a promise of Judah's future deliverance. This is going to come. It's going to happen. Lord, be merciful, but bring it on, let it happen. And then there's this promise that the all-powerful God, this demonstration of God's power in verses 3 through 7, will also be the God that delivers them. We can always find hope and knowing that God has done something before, then, well, it's likely and possible that God might do that again. So people going into captivity could find hope and comfort in knowing that they had gone into captivity before and that God had delivered them from captivity at that time also. Verse 16, I hear and my body trembles, my lips quiver at the sound of rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. So he's saying, I'm scared. You know, that's what this imagery is speaking of. He's scared, he's trembling, he's going to be weak in his flesh, but he's going to wait. He's going to wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. These enemies will suffer. These enemies will be conquered. And because of that, the Lord will eventually deliver us again. Verse 17, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. To the choir master with stringed instruments. This very last line kind of struck me because Habakkuk was just a prophet crying out and complaining. But now he has access to a choir master and the band. You know, it's like, hey, you know, I've been talking with the Lord, complaining, and he's been talking to me, and bad things are coming upon us. But, you know, I wrote this prayer, this poem, this prayer at the end of this time with the Lord, and you know, then he has the power or the authority to commission the choirs and the bands to play it. You know, just, I don't know why that struck me, but like, it seemed like he was just some prophet on the fringe, but now he has access to, you know, this would have been access to those there in the tabernacle or the temple or the place of worship that they had. So he's fearful, verse 16, but he's faithful. And then he goes on to say, it's like he's a different man, a completely different man in verse 17. It's like, even if the crops fail, even if the flocks die, no matter how bad it gets, I will rejoice in God. Now, is that the same guy that wrote those first two complaints, especially the second one? You know, God has done a work. It's amazing what hearing from the Lord can do to change who you are and how you think and how you operate. Just have the Lord speak to you through the scriptures, through the still small voice, through the words of some other person, and you're like, whoa, that was from the Lord to me, and how it can change us and transform us. And I think that's what happened for Habakkuk. He was at the end of his rope. He was complaining. He was crying out, Lord, you know, you don't get it. You know, the bad things are happening here and you're ignoring us. And the Lord's like, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm going to bring these evil people in. It's like, Lord, I thought you couldn't even look upon evil because you're holy, but look at, you're just allowing these guys to trample us. I thought you were all-knowing and all-powerful, but you're allowing a wicked nation to come and devour us. And the Lord speaks to him and opens his eyes and brings clarity. And suddenly he's declaring the power of the Lord. Suddenly he's declaring no matter how bad it gets, whether he's fearful, well, he's ready for it to happen. He's going to wait upon the Lord. And if, man, he goes out there to pick the figs and they're gone. If he goes out to the herd and all the sheep are dead, bad things are coming, he says, I will still rejoice in the Lord. So Habakkuk, in the end, has become a man who will live by faith. Because that's how the just live, right? He wasn't in the beginning. He was living by fear and frustration and anger and ignorance. But in the end, he was a man who was living by faith. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this study. We thank you for the message that you have in it. And Lord, I just pray that you would continue to teach us through your word. We give you thanks. In Jesus' name, amen.